So we've had a little discussion of what to call our subject, and I'll say that in my preparation for this, I was thinking of him by his initials and calling him Fludge. But I am taking Robert Fishman's point that we should have long ago dropped the junior, and I'm happy to call him Flo. And that's kind of appropriate here because one of the real lessons, I think, is that all of these questions flow together, and all of the processes that we're talking about are related and connected and dynamic, right? So I'm going with Flo. This is our last panel, so I want to take a moment to comment on what we've seen today. We've seen a man who is a systematic thinker, a disciplinary founder, a mentor, an educator, a shaper of Washington, Baltimore, Boulder, New Haven, and many more places, a visionary who was frequently overruled and outmaneuvered. And we also learned from Laurie Olin that his work is connected to absolutely everything, including hurricanes and domestic terrorists. Which is, also appropriate, because one of the big themes of Olmsted's life and work is comprehensiveness. And we'll be talking about different aspects of comprehensiveness here today in this panel, as well as maybe how our idea of comprehensiveness now is different from what he thought of when he said something must be comprehensive. In his sense, comprehensiveness means fundamentally the rational marshaling of interests, not the balancing of interests, which is how we talk a lot today about political process and about planning and change, but the marshaling of interests in something that used to be called the public good. And that marshaling is a fusing of special interests, any number of special interests, and a number of underlying ideals. But Olmsted himself had a lot of doubt about what he was doing. He once said, "The future of a live city cannot clearly be forecast." Well, what are we doing then? But okay. And John Peterson, in his book, The Birth of American City Planning, described Olmsted as having a, quote, peculiar mix of skepticism and commitment. So I would like to introduce our own peculiar mix here, or a group that that also following Dr. Fishman might be thought of as our collective Olmsted, because together they have all worked in different kinds of collaborative environments, and most importantly across scales. And their talks now are going to be in ascending order of scale, from the city level up to the mega regional level. And I've asked them each to take a moment at the start of their remarks to comment on the previous speaker's remarks, because each one of them is taking us up a step in thinking about scale and size and impact of the kinds of work that they've been doing. So first we'll hear from Harriet Tregoning, who is the director of the Washington, D.C. Offices of Planning. After that, Congressman Dan Kildee, from the 5th District of Michigan. Congressman Kildee is also the founder of the Genesee County Land Bank, and obviously he has nothing else important he should be doing. And then last we'll hear from Karen Walz, a planner in Texas and the principal of Strategic Community Solutions. Please join me in welcoming Harriet Tregoning.
Thank you, Tim. That might be my favorite introduction ever. I might have to get that particular quote again. Maybe it could be my epitaph. I don't know. I really liked it. I'm delighted to be here. I wanted to thank Tim for that introduction, and to Iris and the organizers of this important forum. Tim mentioned scale. I'm going to talk to you about local and regional. I have worked at the federal level on kind of smart growth policies nationally, and at the state level as the state planning director in Maryland, but I have to say that the most interesting and the most challenging is at the local level, and the politics are also very interesting at that level. In many ways, my experience has been that regional cooperation and the regional scale of working together is essentially, for many people, an unnatural act. Despite the legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and Sr., the DC region has really come together around regional planning, regional efforts, last in the 1950s. And what was the object of our collaboration at that time? It was the metro system, right? That was the last real time that I think we did this, this kind of big thinking, long-term thinking, this collaboration. But you've come to us at kind of an interesting time now. We've really had what Tim described as a fusing of interests and ideals relatively recently around a plan that we're calling Region Forward. It's a plan that takes us through 2050, and it's something that we're really doing kind of on a coalition basis. Our Washington metropolitan region is about 22 different local jurisdictions, cities and counties, and we don't often agree on very many things, but over the last several years, we have really come together on this plan. The three major challenges or opportunities that we're looking at is accommodating an additional 2 million people in this region. We have the 4th largest regional economy and the 7th largest population, but accommodating that many more people is a challenge. We have, like many other regions, aging infrastructure, whether it's broken water lines or a metro rail system that is really beginning to show its age. And finally, we know that we have to use our energy and resources much better. Climate change is real. It's real in our region. We see the effects of it every day. And we both have to do what we can do to mitigate its effect, but most importantly now, adaptation is going to be really key. So, we've come together around a set of common goals and activities, but the biggest thing that we've agreed to do is to really focus our development around a relatively few activity centers in the region. It doesn't look like a few, but these are small. These are like neighborhood size, quarter-mile in diameter size areas, the vast majority of which are served by transit now or will be in the future. And that's where almost all of the housing and the employment is going to be directed in the future in our region. And that was a big deal to come to that, to that goal. How many of you know the Urban Land Institute? They do a lot of forecasting of development trends, and 3 things that they've identified as the top trends are these: mixed-use communities, transit-oriented development, and going green. And these are things that are really featured in our own goals for the region. We actually have more of these places. As dots on the map, you don't really know what they are, but for example, one of those dots is Tyson's Corner. Another dot is Rockville Pike, right? So all of our poster children for sprawl that were on the covers of books, they are now slated to be dense, urban, served by transit places, and we have more of that urbanizing suburban. That's what this dot map represents than any place in the country, and that's because we have come together around a set of goals that have to do with these things: walkable communities, centering development around transit, and green and sustainable development practices. We've set not just a set of goals for the region around these issues, including, like I say, capturing 75% of the new commercial construction in these activity centers, but also we've come together around metrics for these things. So we know where we're going. For example, regarding climate and energy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 20% below 2005 levels by 2020, and by 80% by 2050. We know that we need to achieve 100% of the Chesapeake Bay watershed goals. That we know that we need to combine not just transportation choices, but we need to make sure that the costs of housing and transportation together end up being affordable for people. So we've set a whole bunch of goals around these areas. for transportation particularly, having a system that maximizes connectivity, walkability, and minimizes harm to the region. I mentioned the climate and energy goals, but these are the kinds of places that, I mean, Tyson's has now dropped the corner, right? Because their future is urban. White Flint, downtown Bethesda, Rockville, the Ruston Town Center, I could go on and on. And it also involves really looking at expanding the metro system, coming together around regional goals for transportation, also something that we've never really done. We've been a region like most other regions in the country where we take every jurisdiction's plan, we staple it together, and we call it a regional plan. Well, for the first time, we're coming together around real regional priorities, because that's what we're going to have to do if we're going to expand the metro rail system, if we're really going to serve the population that we'll have over the next 100 years. And part of that reason is because we have looked around at places that have been successful. The 2008 recession, the Great Recession, it was an amazing natural experiment, right? We wouldn't have brought it upon ourselves, but even in our region where we had the same jobs market, right? The same employment market across the region, the experience of different jurisdictions was extremely different, with lots and lots of foreclosure in some parts of the region and catastrophic declines in property value, some of which have not recovered still. And other parts of the region didn't have that at all. Very little foreclosure. In the District of Columbia in 2008, we noticed a strange thing. We shed hundreds of cars off our DMV rolls because we could. Because people could live in the district, they could live in Arlington, they could live in Alexandria with one less car in their household and weather the economic hardship that the recession brought without having to sell their house or go into foreclosure. If they did have to sell their house, they could do it because the property values didn't decline. They weren't underwater, right? So it made an enormous difference. And so now we have more and more across our region, you know, a common belief that transportation choices, giving people that resilience, that flexibility, those options, that is the basis for our development going forward in the region. I won't say that we agree on everything, and I won't say that there's absolute unanimity across all of the jurisdictions, but 22 local governments basically had to legislatively act to adopt this Region Forward plan with its goals, with its metrics, with an agreement that we would try to attain these same things. And that has never happened before in our region. With that, thank you. Sorry.
Well, first of all, let me tell you how happy I am to be here, if you know what I mean. I really like this place, but I like it even more right now. It's good to be invited and actually to return to the subject of much of the work that I've been focused on over the last decade. Before I came to Congress, I'm a freshman, just got elected, so I've had a great first year. Hopefully things will get better. But it's especially good to be back among friends, and particularly to share the stage again with Harriet, with whom I have worked and who I have admired for a long time for her contributions. And much of what she said was interesting because it connects to the work that I'm focused on, or had been focused on, in my hometown of Flint and in many other older industrial communities. And it's to try to create in those places what Harriet described as the necessary connection between communities across the metropolitan area. No more is that critical. It's just so critical, especially in older industrial cities. Cities like my hometown of Flint, which is the birthplace of the auto industry in many ways, and once, until really the mid-1970s, was this really strong, vibrant, and from an economic standpoint, a relatively self-contained community. So the challenge that I will address that relates, I think, to the broader question is the particular challenge in trying to recreate connection between the way communities are designed and the true economic footprint of a metropolitan area. It once was virtually a uniform proposition that cities across this country, but especially the older industrial cities, had a relatively strong relationship between their role in the metropolitan area that they are centered to support and the element or the degree of wealth and economic activity within that metro that is resident within that city. What does that mean? It means that if you were to draw a map of the economy of the community, it would look a lot like the map of the community itself. And that was really important for older industrial cities because it allowed those cities to have access to the resources necessary for them to provide the anchor, the institutional anchor that they need to provide in order to support the vibrant community. But, of course, or the vibrant metro, what happened in a lot of these older cities, for reasons that relate to policy and planning, wealth and economic activity was either relocated or relocated itself to another place within the metro. The story of Flint or Youngstown or Saginaw or fill in the blank, cities that have had significant population loss, often is told in such a way that would have one believe that the community, the larger metro itself, has lost significant population. I was the county treasurer in my own hometown of Flint. I was a county-wide elected official, a county of just under 500,000 people. And for the entire period of time of Flint's decline in its population loss, it went from a city of 197,000 in 1960 to a city of less than 100,000 today. Over that entire period of time, the population of the metropolitan area was virtually static. So the population did not necessarily leave. The population, through lots of policy choices that were made, relocated itself or was relocated. And with that population, more important, was the wealth and economic activity that then supported, through taxation and other activity, the strength of that urban center. So what our challenge was, as we thought about the planning challenge in redesigning a city that once had a population of 200,000 headed to 250,000 to now being a functional city in a metro with the city population about half or less that size, is that how do we recreate the connection between wealth, economic activity, and the city itself? So I was the county treasurer. We rethought the way we deal with urban land and basically made two really, I think, important changes to the system that allowed us to actually go from planning as an exercise in design to planning as a toolkit to realize a new and, I think, much more sustainable metro. We decided that we would rethink how we deal with vacant and abandoned distressed property, of which there are thousands in these older cities. And from a planning standpoint, we made the determination that if we are going to be able to reset the markets in these places, they have to be economically viable. And the way to do that is to erase the assumption that most cities operated under, most cities, whether they're growing or shrinking, operate on the assumption that all land will hold its value or grow in value, and all cities always grow forever. And because those were the underlying assumptions of the systems, we had to rethink the way we connect land to one another. So we came up with a process that allowed the community, and I will be quick, I'm almost done. I always get 1 minute on the floor of the House of Representatives, so I'm kind of taking advantage of the fact that I don't have that limitation. To put it simply, what we did is we completely redesigned the process of acquisition, management, and reuse of the distressed properties in a community by creating a county-wide metropolitan land reuse strategy that erased the notion that each property had to justify its existence and its place in the market all by itself, created a countywide land bank and tax system and redevelopment financing model that homogenized the economics of all the properties that this countywide land bank could gather, so that the wealth that had been relocated across the metro and is manifest in the value and the market viability of properties throughout the metro, that we could then take the valuable land that comes into the public domain through systems of tax foreclosure or outright acquisition and use the equity, the value in that property as we take that land to market to pay for the cost of opening green space in urban communities and urban neighborhoods, the cost of redeveloping property for which the market otherwise would not be capable of absorbing, and essentially reset the land use systems and the economics of the distressed property systems so that it sits upon a countywide or metropolitan or regional platform. It does not force a city that is really loaded with vacant and abandoned distressed properties to also be left to clean up after the mess and deal with that abandonment that is a result of the suburbanization of wealth. It's a very quick explanation of the concept, and it's one that I'll be happy to pursue as we get into discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dan, that's a really fascinating approach. I think as we look at the realities in all of our regions today, those boundaries, those cities, those metros, really don't relate exactly to the way that the market is operating. And I think all of us are facing those kinds of challenges of how do we really make that reflect the real things that are going on. And that's certainly a challenge for all of us, whichever region we're in. We've been talking today about a lot of the principles that Frederick Law Olmsted has, let me get over to, there we go, that his work in the early 21st century reflected, and I think as we've heard today, he really was at the foundation of much of what we think of now in terms of landscape architecture, in terms of urban planning, and certainly in terms of dealing with the politics. Since we just have a few minutes at this point, I'm going to try to focus only on two of those principles, and I want to give you what I see as some of the application today, and then some insights of how we might apply those in today's circumstances and thinking ahead to the later 21st century. The early 20th century principles, we've heard from several folks this morning about Frederick Law Olmsted Jr.'s role in the first conference on of national city planning. And during that conference, it's interesting to go back and read his presentation because he was reporting on a trip he had taken to Europe to understand the planning principles there. And we tend to think about, in those days, the planning principles focusing firstly, and he says this, on mobility. Making sure that as developers are building subdivisions that their new streets actually connect to the old streets. What a concept. You know, that was part of what they were concerned about. And secondly, making the streets wide enough so that they could handle the traffic that was expected. And that, of course, is a common concern now. Second aspect that he talks about there is really what we consider the City Beautiful movement, those monumental plazas, those public buildings, the parks, the monuments, and so forth. But what I found fascinating is that in reporting on his tour, he talks about lessons learned, and he particularly gives some interesting examples from some of the German cities where basically he says, look here, the planning is really a unified project. It's not just about those buildings and those streets. It's about building regulations, health ordinances, policy rules, and the systems of taxation that relate to the physical development pattern. So really effectively that comprehensive approach that he's talking about goes well beyond the design aspects and into many other aspects of the community and of building a community for the future. And so that's one of the things that I think comes out very clearly there, that kind of comprehensive approach, and we've heard other presentations about that earlier today. A second principle that I think is really critical and is one that has implications for us now is ensuring the preservation of valuable natural assets. And what you see here is Olmsted's wording that establishes the purpose of the National Park Service. I think it's a very clear statement of why we should preserve those valuable natural assets. And of course, we've seen those examples earlier in terms of places like Yosemite and others. I think that those aspects of his planning initiatives are ones that are important to us today, but we're dealing with them in a very different context. And I think part of that challenge that we have in thinking about the inspiration we can take from this relates to the fact that we're really dealing with much more complicated kinds of systems, more complexity, and therefore greater challenges in terms of what we think about in terms of comprehensiveness and in terms of those natural assets. And just to give you the start on how that has changed, I want to read you a quote from one of his competitors at that first city planning conference, Benjamin Marsh. And here's his quote: that city planning is a national problem is evidenced by the fact that there are 208 cities in the United States with a population of 50,000 or over. Those are the big cities they're worried about in 1909. Okay, let's fast forward to today, and I think what we're seeing here, of course, is a quite different situation and a quite more, definitely more challenging consideration than what they had then. When he was dealing with those urban areas, he was really dealing with individual cities. And nationally, all but 8 of the cities in this country were under 500,000 population at that time. So today, you take a look at these numbers and you can see what a much more complex situation we have to deal with. Obviously, our population as a whole is much larger. The percentage of our US population that's in urban areas is substantially higher than it was back, and these are the numbers from 1910 and 2010, so you get that 100-year snapshot. There are many more big cities. Look at how many more cities we have over 100,000 population, each of those with its own governance structures, infrastructure, funding, all of those kinds of concerns. The one number that's gone down here is the share of the population that's in the biggest cities. The 10 largest cities in the US have declined in terms of their share of the population. So what that means is that while the concerns that they had in 1909 on things like traffic, on things like public health and safety and housing, those are still here, but today we have to deal with them in a much more complex and much more challenging kind of a circumstance. In my comments today, I'm going to try to highlight just those two principles and give you some examples from my region where I'm working, which is in Texas. And so it's a few more degrees of separation, I think, than what we've been hearing about most of today. But I want to give you some background on the projects we've been doing and then draw from that some insights about how those principles apply as we think about the 21st century. There we go. Okay, so the region that I'm going to focus on is the Dallas-Fort Worth region. And it's quite different from some of the others we've talked about. And I imagine that for many of you, this is probably the view that you recognize, DFW Airport. We actually have, though, more of a region than just the airport, although I think I often find that that's the thing that people are most familiar with in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The city of Dallas is our anchor on the eastern side of the region. The city of Fort Worth anchors the western side, and we have a long tradition of competition between those two cities with collaboration now and then when it seems to make sense for folks. We also have a large number of smaller communities, including many with wonderful historic character, very livable, and some of the historic squares such as you see here. Finally, in the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen a great deal of urban redevelopment, particularly around our DART light rail system, and so the transit-oriented development such as you see here. To give you a little bit more background about our region, the map here shows our 16 counties, and by way of comparison, the geographic area that this region covers is roughly the same as the state of Massachusetts. So it's a somewhat different scale. It's obviously a very large metro. It's a very strong and diverse economy. So we were fortunate not to be hit as hard as many other regions during the last recession or whatever we want to call it. Note that we have a very challenging intergovernmental situation because we've got 16 counties, over 150 cities, and of that, 12 cities that are in that group over 100,000 population. So those are cities that are the size of Orlando, cities that would be major jurisdictions in their own right if they were not located so close to Dallas and Fort Worth. We also anticipate very rapid growth, and our growth is expected, as you can see from these numbers, to nearly double by 2050. So the challenge that our region has been facing is one of dealing with all of that growth in a very complicated kind of a political and governmental situation. We also have another aspect that relates to those natural resources that we talked about earlier, and that is the Trinity River. Both Dallas and Fort Worth were founded on the banks of the Trinity and relate to the trade and to the assets that they had along that river, but over time, those have not played as major a role, and so that's what I'm going to share with you about our natural assets. So with that, let me look quickly at the way those principles play out in this North Texas region and use two initiatives to tell the story of those, and then in turn the implications or the takeaways in terms of how those principles apply to our regions today. Beginning in 2005, our region has used a private, public, and academic partnership called Vision North Texas as a forum for discussion about the best ways to accommodate that growth that I shared with you, and to do that in a way that is both long-term successful and is sustainable. In the course of that initiative, we've had a wide range of stakeholder activities and different sessions. You can see in here the mayor of Dallas speaking at one session, lots of workshop groups, use of Legos for scenario planning, all of those different things with people from all over that 16-county region. The message that we got back from the stakeholders throughout that process was, we want better than the future that we get from business as usual. And so that's what we heard, that's what we tried to accomplish with the North Texas 2050 Vision and Action Package. This package was released in March of 2010, so it's still relatively new, but it's intended to be a regional game book, if you will, that all of those different interests can use to make their own decisions and their own investments. It paints a picture of a future that is better than the business as usual future, and it's been recognized nationally by one of the American Planning Association's Innovation in Sustaining Places Award. Now, this is where we get into the issues of comprehensiveness. This North Texas 2050 is comprehensive in providing recommendations for all of the investment areas that you see here, and you recognize some of those that they were talking about in 1909, but as well a number of additional areas. So we've added to that complexity, and we've also made the recommendations integrate across those different topic areas. In addition, our region, as I showed you, is very diverse in terms of the communities. So we've identified a set of policy areas and centers with recommendations that guide appropriate development policies for each of those areas, because it is not a one-size-fits-all kind of situation within that entire large geography. After the first 18 months of implementing this plan, we had a progress report which was released at a regional summit session, and I know you can't read all of the items that are on that list, but the point that I want to make here is that there was a shared action agenda that was identified, and we've tried to be able to show quickly that there's progress on some things, less progress on other things, and then room to move forward and need to move forward. During this year, that partnership has been focusing on education and dialogue to support healthy communities. So again, one of those issues that is coming back again into the planning framework, and creating a regional forum for dialogue about making sure that the health of the folks in all of our different neighborhoods is really addressed. Today, individual cities, regional transportation and water entities, private property owners, and others are using this kind of a shared agenda as a way to build a future that's better than that business as usual. And since it's a fairly new plan, of course, there's lots of room for discussion about what's going to happen down the line, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. The other area that I wanted to talk about briefly is the role of the Trinity River and the natural assets. Our region obviously does not have the kind of mountain ranges and the kind of ocean views and all that many of Olmsted's clients enjoyed, but nonetheless, we are now returning to the Trinity, which for decades had been really a focus of industrial activity, and really neglected, really ignored by most people in the region. It was kind of a place you didn't want to go to, didn't want to spend time at. And over the last probably 10, 15 years, a number of different partnerships have helped us to address this in a new way. One of the examples of that is the Trinity Parks and Trails system, and you can see here 250 miles of trails. This overall regional vision is being implemented by all the individual cities and counties, and there's just a few examples there of a couple of those cities. And I'll note that the very northern part of that trail plan actually goes all the way up to Oklahoma. So we're trying to think on a typical Texas scale. We'll see if the trails get there before the development does. The last thing I want to point out here is that these trails connect important new natural areas, Audubon centers, recreational amenities, and other things that until a few years ago no one would have imagined to see along the Trinity. That Trinity has also become a focal point for new development and revitalization, particularly in Dallas and in Fort Worth. We're looking at multiple objective programs dealing with economic development, community revitalization, recreation, flood protection, transportation, as well as those environmental assets. And the public and private investment that's happening along there is creating new and revitalizing existing neighborhoods that I think we're finding are particularly appropriate for all of us aging baby boomers as well as the millennials who are looking for mixed-use, livable, convenient housing and neighborhoods with nature close by. So just with that quick overview of some of our projects in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, I'd like to summarize with a few insights of how the principles of Olmsted are being applied now and how they fit with our 21st century complex urban areas. Firstly, in terms of that idea of being comprehensive, I think that we're seeing even more today the benefit from synergy across the different issues that we are dealing with. We have a bigger list of issues and more challenging issues with things like climate change, but we also are seeing the synergies and the connections. For example, the idea of supporting an urban forest as a way to reduce, in our case, the air conditioning load in the buildings that are developed in and around that, or the way that transportation systems can be used to support markets for different kinds of niche housing projects and neighborhoods. So we're seeing those connections in a way that will lead us to even more sustainable communities. Secondly, we have that focus on community building. Olmsted's comments about it's not just about the roads and the public structures and monuments, but it's really about creating the community. And what we've seen is the idea of a shared regional vision as a way to bring people together and make the situation so that individual investments and choices can further that larger whole. As an example, in our region, we have what we call inner-tier communities that are faced with revitalization and intensification of older, kind of tired urban areas. Our outer-tier areas are really very open greenfields. In both of those, the recommendations are structured so that they're appropriate to those areas, so that those outer tier learn the lessons and don't reinvent and don't have to have the same experience that some of the inner tier areas did. In terms of natural asset preservation, we find today that there are even more reasons to preserve those green space areas than the ones that Olmsted espoused as we think about the role of these areas as green infrastructure. And David Rouse, who spoke in answer to a question a little earlier, and one of his other colleagues have recently written a book on landscape as green infrastructure, to which I've contributed a study about our North Texas projects. As we think about those open areas as important for water quality and for flood protection and for erosion control, those are important roles for those areas to play, and increasingly we're finding that the economics pencil out so that those in the long run are more cost effective than our recent past of pipes and concrete. Finally, in terms of civic engagement, this is one of the areas where I think we have some of the biggest challenges compared to the situation in 1909. We recognize that there is a very wide range of stakeholders who must be involved. There are very diverse interests, whether ethnic, income, special interests, all of those things. There is not a single decision maker that can really sort of drive the whole train. And in a region like ours, there is no one city, no one governance structure that can drive the whole train either. So it's really got to be a matter of that engagement, consensus building, and collaboration so that each of the decisions by those different groups will support that larger regional whole. I think that if anything, the places that we've been talking about today that Olmsted designed in the early 20th century are even more beautiful and more enjoyable today than when they were first completed. I think that his principles of a comprehensive approach for city building and preservation of assets have also not faded with time. And the initiatives that we see in our areas and elsewhere are really reflecting those ideas. So I think it's fair to say that the principles that Olmsted elucidated 100 years ago are still ones that have value and inspiration for us as we deal with our far more complex urban areas of today. Thank you.
So it's on? Can you hear me? Am I good? No? I'm talking to myself? We're good? All right, we're good now.
I do that all the time.
Yeah, I do too. We will have time for audience questions, but I want to raise a few topics with the panelists collectively here. You all work across, or referring to work across different scales, different scope, different geographies, but of course they're all marked by intergovernmental collaboration and cooperation. And I wonder, as you look at each other's work, are all intergovernmental relations, equally unhappy, or do you see, distinct differences in the kinds of things that you've dealt with, or you had better or worse kinds of relationships?
Well, if I could just touch on the particular area that I work in, it's not just my hometown of Flint, but it's Detroit and lots of other places. The additional variable that makes it even more challenging to work across jurisdictional boundaries is the political and racial dynamic in many older industrial cities. It doesn't mean that there aren't other big hurdles to overcome, but it's very difficult, and the public engagement part that you referenced is an important way to get to this, but it's a difficult proposition to disabuse citizens of the notion that they can live in their place and that it is not somehow affected or affecting the people who live across the river or on the other side of the county. And of course, we all know that these metros, these regions, are organisms that are interdependent, but when we add the racial dynamic to that, and the word urban becomes code for race, it's one additional hurdle that I think older industrial, particularly older industrial minority communities have to address that is an additional dynamic.
Going around with that?
I think there are a lot of differences. I mean, certainly Dan talked about the differences between growing and shrinking places, and that's a hugely different dynamic. Another difference might be whether communities are diverse, you can say disparate, or whether they're homogeneous. And especially since we seem to societally think diversity is a good thing, that means increasingly different, wider range of constituencies whose interests that you have to manage. But I think that the need to think regionally is important, but I really put a lot of faith in the ability of any one jurisdiction to be able to act autonomously, in the interests of its citizens, and hopefully obtain and measure demonstrably better results. What is really different is the willingness to learn and steal from other communities in terms of good ideas, and the pace of change, I think, has really picked up, both in terms of what might be normative behavior of citizens in a given community, whether that's engagement or how people travel, or what even their changing expectations about what constitutes the good life in our country is becoming very different and much more rapid. But I think that knowledge of best practices, I mean, how many people adopted land banks after you did such a great job in Genesee County? I mean, 100 places did, right? So that part works nationally and globally, but it also is very infectious within a region. So somebody doing something good and getting a good result suddenly makes it a lot easier for the surrounding jurisdictions to do that. And I think that's much more appealing than trying to browbeat each other into agreement for some distant goal that you don't have any idea how you'll get to.
Yeah, I think in our region, in Texas and the West in general, the idea of self-sufficiency applies to the individual jurisdictions just as well as it does to an individual property owner. And every city wants to have its own decision-making, and there's certainly not any interest in having some kind of a regional government telling people what to do or how to do it. But at the same time, I think that when people see mutual benefit, then they can work together on that. That's been the success of our DART system. When I first moved to Dallas was while the starter system was under construction, and we had a lot of those concerns like you were just talking about of we don't want that system in our neighborhood because we don't want the kind of people that are on transit to be in our neighborhood. That has changed around dramatically because people have seen the success and they've seen the kind of development that has happened at the stations, and they say, yeah, that's what we could use that in our community. And even the smaller suburban communities now see that, and they also see the changing demographics. And as we look at the changing interests of people, again, I mentioned the baby boomers and the millennials, there is an increasing recognition that the market for single-family detached homes on large lot is still there, but it's only one market, and that's not all that we should be serving. And I think as those ideas, as people see the economic value of those ideas, and they see the successes that other people are having, it's easier to get that collaboration.
It seems in some ways that you're talking about a level of complexity that is beyond what Olmsted faced in his time, right? That you pointed out that the population is much higher, and that we're dealing with far greater people and all the impacts that they have, but also very demographically complex. Not to say that there weren't demographic issues 100 years ago, but we're really highly attuned to them now, and they seem to be changing very rapidly. I want to switch gears slightly to go from talking about success to talking about failure. One thing that's become clearer.
I assume this will be a question for me.
That depends on you, Congressman. As we've seen over the course of the day, Olmsted had a lot of plans that did not come to fruition or only came partially to fruition. Alex Garvin drew particular attention to New Haven, and we saw any number of places where just things didn't work out. And I'm sure that you have all had to struggle with this in different ways at different points in your career. So I wonder if you could all say something about how you deal with failure and disillusion and belief in what you're doing.
That's a really, really good point, and I do think that is one of the big differences. I don't know that I would agree that we have a lot more complexity now than we had then. I think we understand the complexity that we have now. We were blithely ignorant of the decisions that we made and their impacts at the time, and willing to go ahead without analyzing things to the nth degree to know what might happen. But I also think that we were bolder and willing to try more, and we felt more the newness of this country and the newness of everything that we were doing, and that we were willing to be pioneers in trying new things in our cities, in our communities, more so than now. That's why the idea of failure is really important, and that cities, governments have become very inured, fearful of failing, right? Like if anyone was to give you a piece of advice about politics, it'd be like, you don't want to end up on the front page of your local paper, for this dumb thing that you did, right? So everyone is afraid to make a move that might lead to some sort of failure because the punishments are so harsh and the rewards are so small, right? But that's exactly the wrong attitude. We have to be able to fail in cities. We have to be willing to try the things that may not work. The trick is to fail fast and to try things at a scale that you can pull it back if it doesn't work. But you have to be able to experiment. Bob Yarrow spoke earlier about the need to get a twofer and a threefer out of the things that we do. I mean, Ian McHarg and others before him, Olmsted talked about the value of ecological services that great landscapes provide. Well, now this is a fiscal imperative that we do smarter things, that we get 2 and 3 benefits out of every dollar that we spend, not just a dollar's worth of benefits. And that means trying some things that may not work. I mean, have you seen our bike share system here in Washington?
Great.
It's a success, wouldn't you say?
I love it.
That's our second system. Our first system was an abysmal failure. We don't talk about it much, but I think we should. It was small. It was run by a company whose business was not really bike sharing. It was advertising. They didn't really want to do it. It was only 100 bikes. They weren't in great locations, and we tried to love it, but it was really hard. It didn't work very well, but we learned from that. And we only replaced that dinky system when we had a really good, robust, much larger system ready to go that learned the lessons from that failed small system. So, you know, I think failure is a really important concept, and I'd love to hear what my panelists
Well,
think.
just to hold on that for a second, if the first system did so badly, how did you talk people into the second system?
Well, you know, the idea wasn't a failure. The execution was a failure. So,
Okay.
so taking the things that didn't work and being very specific about what didn't work and why we thought the new thing would work.
Okay.
I think one of the other things about it is just the sense of time that we're dealing with now, and you know, something that, you know, it might seem like it's a failure right now, but it may be that it's just the idea isn't ripe quite yet, and over time that it, you know, will come back around. Some of it, I think, is that technologies that are available now were not available even 5 or 10 years ago. So things you can do today with a smartphone, trying to get those systems in place 10 years ago was such an overwhelming, complex, expensive kind of government activity that it didn't get any traction. And I think, you know, we have the challenge that it's very hard for folks to look as far ahead as some of these long-term plans do, because they're looking at, you know, my term of office is 2 years, or you know, the half-life of whatever, you know, business operation I have is very short, and that is a challenge for us in some ways. But on the other hand, it means that the timing and the interest and the support for an idea may come around sooner again.
You know, this point couldn't be stated more clearly. I'm glad that you raised this, and particularly glad to hear these comments. You know, when I decided to take on this issue of vacant land in my hometown of Flint, the risk of failure, or the likelihood of failure, was really high. I mean, when you think about it, you talk about a weak market community. For the most part, this was a no market community, where the idea of selling land was, you know, really quite impractical. We were just trying to manage all the land that had been forgotten. That folks were walking away from. We didn't have a lot of failure, mainly because there's a lot of failure in these systems. We looked at our 4 predecessor land banks. There had been land banks before. We looked at Louisville, Atlanta, Cleveland, and St. Louis. And in every respect, the one characteristic that we found to be repeated as the regrets or the failure was not being big enough, not being bold enough, not taking enough risk. So the irony, of course, in a lot of these places is that the risk aversion that most public officials have either in their DNA or it's in the drinking fountain in City Hall makes it even more difficult to be willing to take the big risks that, in a sort of perverse sort of logic, mitigate failure, make it less likely that you'll fail. I think the biggest failure most communities have is the failure to think big, take risk, and take chances, and have a culture that realizes that creativity is a function of experimentation. Experimentation is managing failure and learning from it. And unless you're willing to do that in the urban setting, the likelihood is what we'll have is sort of a slow muddling along, a non-headline failure, one that is the death of 1,000 cuts. And that's, I think, the most dangerous thing for many of these places.
Well, this brings us back to a theme that Tom Campanella raised at the start of the day, which is that many people see planners as too often sacrificing courage for compatibility. That getting along and not creating too many enemies is what people choose over that big, bold step. So the last question that I want to ask before we open this up is planning as a profession the best way to pursue planning's goals. There are all these things we want to do. Are planners the people to do it?
You know, that's a great question, and you know, as you think about the
like
profession of planning, you know, you do have to ask that question, because I think that in many communities, the institutional structure is such that planners are not encouraged to be as bold as they need to be, and I think it is a difficult thing now in many places. But I think you need to have that expertise, and I guess in my experience, that expertise partnered with somebody who may be in a different role, who can be a champion from the outside, so that there's some kind of collaboration, so that you've got the best of the professional insights and that expertise, but also if the expertise is within an institutional setting where, you know, you can't get past the city manager or something of that kind, to have outside champions, and certainly nonprofit groups, as some we've heard from today, often can fill that role and make for that partnership, so the planners can be able to be as bold as their thinking would allow them to be.
Harriet, take it.
I think planning is necessary but not sufficient to get anything to actually change. So I think that that you do need a vision. I mean, I think that's an incredibly important thing. You can't just do stuff. Activity isn't sufficient. You have to know kind of what it is that you're trying to get to. But I also think that planning is a very bad name. You know what I mean? It's like I've worked, well, I won't say who I've worked for. I'll say that there are people who believe planning equals inaction. So if you're an elected leader of action, planning is the opposite of what you want to do. So in some ways, planners are managers of change, right? That's what the job really is. You know, you are managing change in communities, whether that's you're managing a decline, you're managing growth, you know, because it, first of all, says to people, staying exactly as you are with no change, not an option, okay? That's not an option. That's not among the choices that are in front of you. The question is, how will this community change? How will you be involved in that change? What will happen as a result of the change that you collectively manage? That's really the question, because we end up in a lot of times, you know, having a conversation about, well, why does this have to change? I don't want anything to change. And in fact, you know, that's not something that we control. Things are changing all the time. So I think that we sometimes frame the discussion very wrong, but I think planning is absolutely essential, especially the part that Olmsted brought to planning, the big vision,
Right.
the big aspiration, the bigness of the idea. I think that is very powerful and exciting to people, and sometimes the very small little things that we do don't inspire people as much as they need to. And I think when it comes down to it, people actually have very big aspirations for their community, and there's no community, if you get right down to it, that really that don't have things that they'd like to see change, that they don't have things that they'd like to see get better, in some cases dramatically better. But at the same time, it's a fearsome process to go through that and to imagine how things might be very different in your community. And we have a track record where that change has been very, very bad in some places, not what you would want to have happen. So those are things planners have to overcome.
Well, I'm not a planner, so I will tell you that I think the most important thing that I learned in the time that 25 years I was in county government is that the worst thing you can do is to consign any of the disciplines that make up an important organization, whether it's planning or finance or all the other pieces of this, to their own room for their own purposes and with their own expertise. Planning is important, an element to integrate in the overall operations of a community or a place or an organization as any other. And I think when we think of it as having sort of its own room and people who wear a certain kind of shoe, we consign those folks to be the people who create documents that don't really relate to the work that we're dealing with every day. Planning is as important a part of dealing with, say, for example, dealing with the issues of crime in a community as the police officers are. And so to separate planning from the rest of the functioning of an organization, which often communities do, I think is the mistake.
Yeah, if I could add one thing I really agree with Harriet's comment about the importance of having that vision, and that planning can and should play a major role in helping a community figure out what that vision is. Planners, by their training, have the ability to bring in a lot of different substantive areas and to work with disparate people in the community, and that's a background, a professional training that not all other disciplines have. So they've got a strength there. I think we sell ourselves short, where in many communities, planners are viewed as simply the regulators and the people with the red tape, and that's where we really run into problems.
Well, and to build off something that the Congressman said, it's sort of criminal to have a plan that doesn't have implementation built in.
Right.
So like you should be implementing the plan the day it's done, the day the ink is dry, so that you know the next 2 or 3 things that are going to happen. Because I have to say, a plan has a relatively short shelf life if it doesn't get implemented. But if it does begin to get implemented, it actually becomes kind of a more powerful thing. It gains credibility, it gains momentum, it gets support from people who weren't part of the planning process, that it really is a virtuous cycle. And that I don't think enough planners understand that or know that or practice it. And they need, plans are not self-implementing, so they need all those other elements of government and the private sector to be implementing right away. And the great thing about today is that we have so many different types of people. Things can be implemented even temporarily, so that people can see what the plan would look like if realized. And even the ability to see it physically on the ground. Jeanette Sadiq Khan in New York, you may not love everything that she's done with transportation, but the power of temporary to help people see what is possible is something we have a lot of capacity to do now, and I think that's very powerful.
Ladies and gentlemen, the new Olmstedians. We have plenty of time for questions. I see someone in the back there. Get that man a microphone.
Hi, my name is John Christensen, and I'm a historian at UCLA, so I hope you'll pardon me if I'm a little bit of a downer dude and thinking about the spectacular failure of the Olmsted-Bartholomew plan in LA, and then reflecting on a lot of the presentations today, and this morning, and following up on Timothy's question about failure. And we heard a lot about failure, but after listening to your panel, I'm thinking everything's hunky-dory now, and we'll all be fine if we just embrace failure, and if we let things bubble up, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. And so I want to ask a kind of very simple question to try to get at this, and ask each of you for just a really short, simple answer to what is it that when you wake up in the middle of the night, you are afraid will make your visions and plans not work out?
So many things.
You realize that you're talking to a congressman? I will say this. The thing that, to answer the question directly, but I want to comment on the premise of your question. The thing I worry most about is what I have forgotten or what I have missed. We could drive ourselves insane worrying about the external variables over which we have no control. The thing I worry about is whether or not there was something that should have been considered that was on my watch that I failed to consider. And that's true of any organization and anybody within an organization. The point that I guess I was trying to make anyway about failure is that the fear of failure is so paralyzing in the public sector that we all have to play a role in somehow at least providing space for failure. I'm not suggesting that all is hunky-dory, but the one thing we know for certain is that we will absolutely fail if we're not willing to take the risk of failure. And that's true in government just like it is in industry and any other institutional setting.
I would say too that there's so many things. I mean, I have a lot of strategies for how to sleep at night, you know, because on any given day there are many things that could prevent, you know, something good from happening. In some ways, maybe because I am sort of a pessimist, you know, when it comes to human nature, that I am daily surprised that things are happening and things that are going forward, and that amazes and delights me. So
The sun came up again?
yeah, you know,
Not today, not today.
but I would say that you know, the failure of a plan isn't often the plan. It's the implementation of the plan, the constituency building for the plan. It might happen in that first 3 months after the plan was completed. If something failed to happen, that took the life out of the plan. So, you know, I don't know the circumstances in Los Angeles, and we've got a whole, there've been exhibit after exhibit here in this building of things that didn't happen in Washington, some of which we're very grateful didn't happen, some of which we mourn. But you know, the Congressman is exactly right. We'll never have a better place if we don't try things that have a high risk of failure. You know, if we don't imagine a better place and be willing to work to try to have that happen. And the fact that what is amazing about Olmsted, and this is true for all of us, once you do have a success, then you can beat other people about the heads and shoulders with it and say, you know, why can't we do this in other places? Why can't we do something like that here? And in Washington, at least in the last dozen years, that's been a little bit more of our story locally than in the past. That we've had a run of very good things happening, and that's given us more of an appetite to try to do things going forward.
I guess the short answer would be worrying about the idea that the support will change before things have gotten far enough along to build momentum, whether that's political support, resource support, community support, or what have you. But I think the bigger thing for us all to worry about is whether our plans, it's great to have the vision, but do we have implementation that can be adaptable and resilient enough to last over a long period that it's going to take to get them done?
Yes, over here on the aisle. Yeah.
Hi. My name's Nancy Meyer, and I'm from Michigan, and I also was a city councilwoman in Ithaca, New York for 8 years. And my question to you, Dan, Congressman, is how do you in Michigan deal with the fact that the governor has taken away some of the rights of the elected officials, and as that relates to planning? Because that's what we did. We had a planner in Ithaca, but they had the vote.
Right. It's a great question, and it's really a timely question because some of you may be familiar with this. In Michigan, there are several cities that are now under state control. They have emergency financial managers that are running the cities. The city of Detroit is one, the city of Flint. We've had this in other places around the country, mostly older industrial cities. And you're going to get me editorializing on this. I'll just say this. The notion that governors can supplant local leadership to fix the economic failure of a city presumes that the failure of that place was a failure of its local leadership. And anybody who knows anything about the development of metros and of state and federal policy, which to a great extent has paid for the suburbanization and exurbanization and relocation of wealth from those cities, would know that simply taking one manager and supplanting them with another is not going to erase a system that supports suburbanization of wealth. And what we've seen time and time again is that, and this is a really important lesson for the previous point that I was making, cities are organisms. They're not organisms. They're not corporations where you can just bring in new management, sell off the assets, and move on. You cannot liquidate an organism, a city, a place. Municipal corporations are simply a way to organize public services in those places. And so this notion, and Detroit is going to be the case study, that new management will fix what is a much bigger planning and investment policy failure, is the notion that we're going to pay a big price for if we don't change the way we think of this question.
I will say that when you hear about all the powers that the emergency managers have, it's got to make planners and landscape architects jealous, right?
You know, the interesting thing about it is,
Maybe you
but
like
this gets to the
Robert
point, the thing that those emergency managers can't do is reach into the next community and say, you know, you and the city, you're going to work together now on transit. All they can do is organize the authority of that local city, and what it's proving is that it's not the decision-making alone. Sure, have there been bad decisions? No question. The former mayor of Detroit today was just sentenced to 28 years in a federal prison. It wasn't for bad planning. But there are lots of other factors that we need to keep in mind. In these cities, we have had one of the reasons I ran for Congress, we've had a policy paradigm in this nation that basically operates on the assumption that all development is good and that all forms of land use are equal. And cities are unique characters. Cities are critical. That's where invention occurs. It's where creativity is most likely to take place. It's where we find the greatest possibility for equality of opportunity. And we can't operate on the assumption that wherever we build it is fine as long as it has value, and expect our community and our nation to be able to sustain itself and be competitive.
I'd vote for you if I
All
could.
right. I wish you could.
Do either of you want to run with this idea about our conceptions of developments?
I heartily
No,
agree.
just say, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, on the end, over here.
First of all, in regard to the earlier line of discussion, I'd like to propose Olmsted as a pioneer of plannerly paralysis. A lot of if you look at his private letters, correspondence, even some of his reports that I've seen in relation to Rock Creek Park, Rock Creek Parkway, his role in the Yosemite Board of Expert Advisors, he's always asking, he frustrates his colleagues. We can't do anything yet. There's a sort of plannerly Hippocratic oath, first do no harm. I want another study. Can we have another study of this? Can we have some more? For all this talk of, Daddy, I think, was more into the big plans. I think, and this is one of the ways that I would argue that Olmsted plays an important role in the development of 20th century planning. Rick, is that he does exhibit this kind of caution, at least in a lot of experience that I've had. But in terms of question, and this also gets back to the 6 degrees of separation notion and the enduring influence of Olmsted and the Senate Park Commission plan. 6 or 8 years ago, I was approached by a private firm that was contracted to develop transportation infrastructure around Dallas-Fort Worth. They were going to do a parkway, which they admitted was a way of, making the local populace happy about getting a freeway. So like we saw with the Rock Creek Parkway Beltway. So to their credit, they came up here. They also went to Westchester County, Long Island. They brought half a dozen guys out and looked at a bunch of pioneering parkway developments, actually very much like the Senate Park Commission. And we showed them around Rock Creek Parkway, Mount Vernon Memorial Highway, George Washington Memorial Parkway, the Baltimore Washington Parkway, this kind of a parkway of the 20s, 30s, 50s, and 60s. And of course, they liked the newest one because it was most like an expressway, but they were willing to countenance some things. So my question is twofold. in terms of this, the privatization of public infrastructure support and how that fits into the planning issues today, and also whether this actual individual plans, did they ever eventually incorporate some of what we would consider to be some of these Olmstedian Parkway ideals?
Okay. The privatization is an interesting question. Our region, the Council of Governments and the Metropolitan Planning Organization for our region have been very creative in using privatization as a way to fund infrastructure that otherwise there's no money for. And so they've been able to make some trades using the North Texas Tollway Authority bonding ability, so that they've been able to develop some infrastructure that's particularly on the west side, the Fort Worth side of the region, and in the northern part of the region, which would have been years. I think the current TxDOT estimates were that if they had to wait for the TxDOT funding, it would be 30 or 40 years from now when they would get to it. So, you know, it really has advanced that. But I think one of the interesting things, and I'm not sure which parkway the folks that you're referring to, because there have been several that might apply to. One of those that I have some familiarity with is along the Trinity in Dallas. In the 90s and the early 2000s, we were having a huge debate, which continues in various forms. But part of the challenge for Dallas is to try to figure out how to include what was called the Trinity Parkway as a way to meet transportation demands in the center of that part of the region. And at the time that we were doing what's now called the Balanced Vision Plan that was adopted in 2003, we had, you know, on one side people who had very strong opinions about how or whether that could be incorporated into a broader area with flood control, with parks and all those other things. And we had the transportation folks who basically said, well, you can talk all you want, but we're going to make it like this, and it's going to look like all the other freeways. Today, TxDOT's attitudes about that have changed. And so some of the design work that's going on now as the kind of next iteration of that plan is incorporating those ideas to a far greater extent, because even those, the folks who at that point were looking only at how fast can we move the cars through, are gaining an appreciation for the urban fabric and the market opportunities and all those other things. So those attitudes have changed, I think, quite a bit even in the last 5 to 10 years. So I think that gives hope and opportunity in a lot of places.
I think that there's a lot of those conversations happening in our region right now, especially when it comes to roadways and road construction for some of the same reasons. The gasoline tax is absolutely no longer the appropriate vehicle for funding, no pun intended, for financing transportation in our country. And I'm sure that now that Dan is in Congress, that we'll fix that, and we'll get a funding mechanism. But it's the desperation, you know, that's leading local governments to look to do this. And part of the problem is we're not carefully framing what the objectives are of these privatization deals, and it's not. I mean, we see in some instances around the country that we're really pitting the profit of the private entity. You know, they want more cars on those roads versus the other goals, the climate goals, the transit goals. You know, we want to see fewer people on the roads and more people in transit, and you have to frame these agreements in a way that allows you to meet all those objectives, not just, you know, the profit motive. And so we have situations in this country, maybe in our region, where the taxpayers in a state will end up paying the developer of the road, the private entity, if we are too successful getting people out of their cars. Right? That's a terrible situation for the public sector to be in. So, you know, I think we have to be very cautious about that.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up here. I want to thank all of you for this great day, this whole day focused on Olmsted. You know, Mark Twain said that if you pick up a cat by the tail, you will learn things that you will not learn in any other way.
Is that what we've done?
And I think today here we have learned things that we would learn in no other way, and no cats were harmed. So thank you.